I stood alone at the defense table in probate court with one folder and one pen. Across the aisle sat my father, Warren Hayes, my brother Brett, and the kind of attorney people hire when they want money to look like morality. Victor Langley wore confidence like a second suit, polished, expensive, certain that a self-represented daughter could never survive what he had prepared. Brett leaned back, looked me over like a mistake, and said loudly enough for the people behind him to hear, "No lawyer? Olivia, you're finished." A few people lowered their eyes and smiled. My father did not laugh, but the look on his face was worse. Warren smiled with the satisfaction of a man who believed the world had arranged itself correctly again, with his son protected, his daughter cornered, and the family story back in his hands. To him, I was still the quiet child at the table, the girl who swallowed unfairness because arguing only made the room colder. To Brett, I was the sister who had stolen what he thought belonged to him. To Victor Langley, I was a convenient narrative. Lonely granddaughter, aging grandfather, unexpected inheritance, suspicious influence. Then Judge Evelyn Mercer opened the thick personnel file before her. At first, no one understood why she had stopped reading the probate summary. She turned one page, then another, and something in her expression shifted. It was not shock exactly. It was recognition. Victor noticed first. His posture changed, and the confidence in his face tightened. Brett leaned toward him and whispered, "What? Did she forget to fill something out?" Victor did not answer. He reached for his own copy, scanned the first marked page, then the second, and the color drained from his face. He looked from the file to me, then back to the file, as if the woman across from him had become someone else. The words slipped out before he could stop them. "Oh my God!" My father frowned. "What is happening?" Judge Mercer removed her glasses and looked directly at Victor. "Counsel, I strongly suggest you stop treating Ms. Hayes like she walked into this courtroom unprepared." Brett gave a nervous little laugh, but no one joined him. The judge continued evenly, "She does not need a lawyer." The room went still. 5 seconds later, my father reached for the table, his body folding forward before anyone could catch him. But to understand why Warren Hayes fell in that courtroom, you need to understand the daughter he thought I was, and the woman he never bothered to know. Before that courtroom learned my name, my family had decided what it meant. In the Hayes house, the rule was never written down, never framed, spoken over dinner, but every person inside those walls lived by it. Brett mattered. Olivia managed. Brett forgot the trash because he was tired from practice. I forgot once because I had stayed late at school and Warren called me irresponsible. Brett brought home a C, and my father said pressure was different for boys. I brought home an A-, and he asked why it was not perfect. That was how favoritism worked in our home. It did not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it came dressed as reason. Brett needed encouragement. Brett needed confidence. Brett needed a second chance, then a 10th. I was strong, practical, mature, easy. Those words sounded like compliments until I understood what they meant. Strong meant no one planned to comfort me. Mature meant I was expected to swallow disappointment. Easy meant my needs could be postponed without guilt. Warren worshipped my brother, and the rest of us arranged ourselves around it. Brett was the son who would carry the Hayes name, the one my father called the future even when that future needed rescuing. When Brett turned 17, after failing 2 classes and blaming a teacher, Warren bought him a used truck and called it Motivation. That same spring, I won a regional debate competition and came home to a lecture about discipline because I had missed one Saturday chore. When I asked why Brett got rewarded for failing while I got corrected for winning, Warren looked at me like I was difficult and said, "Your brother needs encouragement. You can handle disappointment." I carried that sentence for years. My mother, Marianne, did not cut me the way my father did. Her damage was softer, which made it harder to explain. She looked away when Warren criticized me. She sighed when I defended myself. She touched my wrist under the table and whispered, Don't make this harder than it needs to be. As if the problem was my reaction, not the unfairness that created it. By 12, I stopped waiting for her to defend me. By 16, I stopped asking. The only person who named the truth was my grandfather, Colonel Arthur Hayes. One afternoon, after Warren skipped my scholarship dinner to help Brett shop for a motorcycle, Arthur found me behind his garage. He handed me a bottle of root beer and sat beside me without forcing me to talk. After a while, he said, "You know what their problem is, Liv?" I shrugged because I was 13 and tired of pretending I did not care. Arthur looked at me and said, "They're measuring you with the wrong ruler." I did not understand him then, but I never forgot. Years later, that same sentence would come back to me in court, right before my father realized the ruler he used on me had been wrong my entire life. At 18, I stopped waiting for Warren Hayes to decide what I was worth and made the first decision that did not require his approval. I told my family I was joining the army, and for 1 second, nobody spoke. Then Warren laughed, not from humor, but from disbelief. "You'll quit before basic training ends," he said, as if stating a weather report. Brett leaned back in his chair and added that I was too sensitive to take orders, too serious to survive jokes, too rigid to belong anywhere people tested you. Marianne touched her napkin and said my father was only worried, which was how she softened every insult until it looked almost like love. Arthur was the only one who did not smile. He stood slowly, looked at Warren, and said, "Funny, your father said the same thing to me before I left for Vietnam." The room went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Warren did not answer. Brett stopped grinning. For the first time in my life, I watched my father lose control of a room, and I understood that quiet authority could be stronger than volume. The army did not rescue me gently. Basic training was brutal, and I was not the fearless girl people later pretended I had always been. I cried once in a bathroom stall where no one could see me, not because I wanted to quit, but because I was tired of proving I had a right to stand anywhere. Then I wiped my face, went back out, and learned something my family had never given me. A standard could be harsh and still be fair. If I worked, it showed. If I performed, it counted. No one asked whether Brett needed more support. No one told me I was strong enough to go without. Years passed, and the uniform became less like armor and more like evidence. I became an officer, then moved into military compliance and procurement investigations, where pressure was not emotional. It was procedural. I learned to read contracts, identify fraud patterns, interview witnesses, build timelines, preserve records, and testify under oath without letting anger leak into my voice. I sat through internal hearings, administrative reviews, and federal inquiries involving missing funds, falsified vendor documents, and people who lied with confidence because they assumed confidence sounded like truth. At home, none of it seemed to matter. When I received a commendation, Warren changed the subject to Brett's newest business idea. When I became an officer, Marianne asked if I wanted something less stressful. Brett borrowed money again, and Warren called him ambitious. I still hoped that one promotion might make my father look impressed. It never did. By the time they dragged me into court, they thought I was alone, but I had spent 15 years learning how to survive rooms designed to break people. For years, I thought Arthur loved me because he was kinder than everyone else. But as I got older, I understood kindness was only part of it. My grandfather was not blind to the Hayes family pattern. He saw Brett get rescued again and again, then watched Warren rename every rescue as belief. He saw my brother fail upward through excuses, loans, and second chances. He saw me arrive when no one asked, solve problems no one thanked me for, and leave quietly so everyone could pretend nothing was uneven. When Marianne went into the hospital for minor surgery, I drove 6 hours overnight after a 12-hour shift because Warren said he was too overwhelmed to manage the house alone. Brett sent flowers, bought with Warren's credit card, and called once from a golf course. Warren told everyone Brett had been thoughtful enough to brighten his mother's room. Arthur watched me refill prescriptions, update nurses, and sleep in a chair beside Marianne's bed. He watched me say nothing. Arthur had his own way of handling disappointment. He did not shout. He documented. Over the years, he loaned Brett money for a fitness studio that closed before the second rent payment was due. He covered Warren's tax penalties after Warren called them a temporary accounting error. He paid one business debt because Warren said embarrassment would destroy Brett's confidence. Each time, Arthur kept paperwork, emails, promises, and the silence that followed. He was not fooled, he was patient. My relationship with him became where love never felt like an invoice. I called every Sunday, whether I was stateside, exhausted, deployed, promoted, or pretending I was fine. Sometimes we talked about military history. Sometimes we argued about baseball. Sometimes we said little, and somehow that still felt like being understood. He asked about my investigations, stress, sleep, and whether I was eating enough. I never asked about money. I never asked about the will. I never knew what he owned. Then Arthur had a stroke. He was weaker afterward, but his mind stayed sharp. I visited while on leave. Brett came once, took a smiling photo, then left early for a golf weekend. Warren told relatives Brett was too emotional to stay. Arthur waited until we were alone, took my hand, and said, "People show you who they are when they think nobody is keeping score." I laughed through tears. He squeezed my fingers and said, "I kept score." 2 weeks later, he was gone. At the funeral, Warren performed grief-like duty. Brett checked his phone. I stood beside the casket feeling like the only person in the room who had lost a person, not a future payout. 1 week later, the will was read, and they learned Arthur's silence had never meant he was fooled. It meant he was watching. 1 week after Arthur's funeral, we gathered in the conference room of Nora Bell, the attorney who had handled his affairs for 20 years. Warren sat as if grief had appointed him executor of everyone's emotions. Marianne kept a tissue folded in her palm. Brett scrolled through his phone until Nora began reading. At first, everything sounded ordinary enough to keep the room calm. Arthur left his military medals to a veterans museum with a note about service belonging to history, not ego. He left Marianne a box of letters from my grandmother. He left Warren his father's watch. He left Brett old tools from the workshop, which Brett barely glanced at because tools were not liquid or useful to a man calculating cash. Then Nora turned to the estate summary, and the air changed. Arthur had not been wealthy in the loud way people respected from a distance. He drove the same truck for 15 years and reused envelopes until the corners split. But behind that plain life were investment accounts, rental properties, undeveloped land, and a private trust worth several $1,000,000. Brett put his phone down. Warren leaned forward. Marianne's tissue stopped moving. Nora read the distribution carefully. Sentimental items would go where Arthur named them. Brett would receive a modest cash amount, but only after documented unpaid loans were deducted from it. Warren's face tightened. Brett laughed once, sharp and confused, like someone had read the wrong page. Then Nora said the majority of the estate, including the trust, the properties, and controlling authority over future charitable distributions, had been left to me. For a moment, nobody spoke. Marianne whispered, "Arthur would never do that." Nora continued before anyone could interrupt. Arthur had included a personal letter. Her voice remained professional, but every word seemed to find the old bruises in me. "I am leaving the largest share to Olivia, because she understood responsibility without needing applause. She showed up when nobody promised her anything. She loved me when there was nothing to gain. That is the only kind of love I trust with what I built." I looked down because if I looked at Warren, I would have broken. Brett broke first, but not from grief. "That sounds exactly like something she would write." Warren stood and pointed at me, saying I had manipulated a dying man, isolated him, poisoned him against his own blood. Brett joined in, claiming I had used military discipline to control an old man's schedule. Marianne begged me to do the right thing and give the estate back to the family. I said quietly, "I am family." Warren looked at me with contempt. "Not like Brett is." 3 weeks later, the lawsuit arrived. Undue influence, fraud, elder manipulation, mental incapacity. They wanted the will invalidated and the estate frozen. Reading it, I understood they were not chasing only money. They were trying to erase the person who had truly seen me. They thought the lawsuit would scare me into surrender. Instead, it gave me something I had never had before, a room where they would be legally required to listen. The first morning of trial should have felt dramatic, but it did not. It felt ordinary in the cruelest way, like the world had decided my family's attempt to erase Arthur's last decision was just another appointment on a courthouse calendar. I arrived alone in a navy suit, parked 2 rows from the entrance, and sat for a moment. In the mirror, I looked calm enough to fool strangers. My right hand trembled once before I pressed it flat against my folder and made it stop. Fear and confidence, I reminded myself, look almost identical from outside. The difference is what you do next. Warren arrived 10 minutes later with Brett and Victor Langley. Brett's expensive SUV sat crooked across a restricted space, and when a security officer looked toward it, Brett laughed and said he would pay the ticket with his inheritance. He wanted me to hear that. He wanted every small moment to remind me that the ending had already been written. Victor greeted me with professional warmth that carried no respect. When I confirmed I was representing myself, he gave a careful nod and said, "That is certainly your right." Brett grinned. "Even your enemy thinks you're crazy." Inside the courtroom, Judge Mercer took the bench, and Victor immediately became the kind of man people trust before they know why. He did not sound cruel. That made him more dangerous. He presented my grandfather as elderly, grieving, physically weakened, and emotionally dependent on the granddaughter who called every Sunday. My closeness became constant access. My visits became opportunities for influence. My military discipline became controlling behavior. By the time he finished speaking, love had been translated into strategy, and grief had been turned into evidence against me. Then came the witnesses. Mrs. Helen Price, Arthur's neighbor for nearly 20 years, testified that I visited often and that Arthur had mentioned changing his will after I started coming around more. Raymond Hollis, an old family acquaintance, claimed Arthur seemed isolated near the end of his life, though he spoke in the vague tone of someone repeating a conclusion he had been handed. A distant cousin said I had always known how to make myself look responsible, as if responsibility were a costume. None of it was explosive. That was the point. Victor was not proving the lie yet. He was arranging suspicion into a shape people could recognize. When it was my turn, I asked short questions. I did not argue with Helen. I did not shame Raymond. I did not defend my childhood to a cousin who had barely noticed it. I wrote dates, phrases, and contradictions in the margins of my notes, then sat down. I could feel the courtroom deciding I was overwhelmed. Warren smiled with quiet satisfaction. Brett leaned back as if he were already spending money Arthur had never meant for him. During lunch, Brett passed me in the hallway and whispered, "You should have taken the settlement when Dad offered it." I said nothing. He stepped closer and added, "You're not built for this." I finally looked at him and said, "That is the mistake all of you keep making." By the end of that first day, they believed my silence was fear. They did not understand that I had spent my career letting careless people talk long enough to bury themselves. By the afternoon recess, the courthouse hallway felt quieter than the courtroom had. I sat near a window, reviewing the notes I had taken while Victor Langley built his story around my grandfather's weakness and my supposed ambition. The notes did not look emotional. They looked like dates, names, contradictions, and places where memory had bent around convenience. That steadied me. Judge Mercer passed by with files under one arm, then paused. For a moment, I thought she would keep walking because judges do not usually stop to speak with the person everyone expects to lose. Instead, she looked at the papers in my lap and asked, "Ms. Hayes, why are you representing yourself?" I could have given her the answers people respected. I could have said legal fees were expensive, that I knew the facts better than anyone, that I wanted to protect Arthur's estate from being drained by the same people trying to steal it. All of that was true, but none of it was the center. So I closed the folder and told her the truth. "Because this is not really about money." Judge Mercer did not interrupt. I looked through the window, then back at her. "My father and brother have spent my entire life defining me before I could speak. Cold, difficult, too independent, ungrateful. They could say anything in a family room because there was no oath, no transcript, and no one willing to correct them. But a courtroom is different." I held the folder tighter. "This time, if they lie about who I am, someone is going to write it down." Her expression did not soften, but it changed. She studied me the way trained people study facts, not performances. Then she said, "You seem unusually calm. You seem—" I smiled. Occupational hazard. Her eyes moved to the thick file under her arm. Several pages were marked with colored tabs, and I recognized the format before I understood why she had it. It was not the short public summary of my service record. It was the complete version, the kind that held evaluations, training, investigations, testimony, commendations, and years my family had never bothered to ask about. Judge Mercer shifted the file against her side and said, "Courtrooms have a way of revealing things people work very hard to hide." At the time, I thought she meant Warren. The next morning, she walked in carrying 2 files. One belonged to Arthur's estate. The other belonged to me. And that was when Victor Langley stopped smiling. Warren and Brett arrived on the second morning looking restored by their own certainty. The first day had given them exactly what they wanted. Witnesses who sounded reasonable, a lawyer who controlled the room, and me sitting alone with a pen while everyone mistook restraint for collapse. Brett glanced at me before he sat down and asked if I had slept badly, as if exhaustion would finally make me easier to defeat. Warren adjusted his cufflinks and said, "Reality has a way of arriving late for stubborn people." I did not answer. I had learned long ago that men like Warren confuse silence with permission, and Brett confused it with weakness. Let them. Judge Mercer entered carrying 2 files. One was the estate file everyone expected. The other was thicker, darker, and marked with colored tabs. Victor Langley saw it before anyone else did. His expression did not break, but it tightened in a way I recognized from depositions, the moment a confident person realizes a fact has entered the room that does not serve him. Victor stood first and asked for summary consideration on several evidentiary issues. He said my self-representation had already created procedural concerns. He implied, with polished courtesy, that I did not understand how certain records should be admitted, authenticated, or challenged. He suggested the court limit what I could introduce before the proceedings became confused by emotion, speculation, or improper foundation. He never called me incompetent. He was too skilled for that. He simply built a careful little fence around me and expected the judge to help lock it. Judge Mercer listened until he finished. Then she looked at him over the top of the file. "Counsel, what exactly is your position regarding Ms. Hayes's ability to represent herself?" Victor adjusted his jacket. "Your Honor, my position is that Ms. Hayes is at a significant disadvantage." "I see," Judge Mercer said. Then she opened the second file. She read without drama, which somehow made it worse for them. Commissioned officer, advanced military legal education, federal procurement fraud training, participation in internal financial misconduct investigations, testimony in administrative hearings, preparation of evidentiary timelines in complex contracting reviews, commendation for exposing a falsified vendor certification scheme that had moved through 3 offices. With each item, the courtroom became less certain of the woman they had been told I was. Victor reached for his copy and began scanning fast, then slower. Brett leaned toward him and whispered, "What does that mean?" Victor did not look up. "It means we misread her." Judge Mercer closed the file halfway and said, "Ms. Hayes has handled matters more complex than this probate dispute. She is not wandering through these proceedings without relevant experience." Then, after a pause that seemed to press every lie flat, she added, "She does not need a lawyer." The room went still. Warren looked at me, truly looked, but not with pride, with fear. That hurt more than I expected because part of me had still wanted the recognition to be love. Instead, he stared as if I had become dangerous overnight. He had never imagined me becoming complete. The first witness returned 5 minutes later. This time, when I stood to question her, nobody laughed. When Mrs. Helen Price returned to the stand, the room had changed. The day before, she had looked at me with the confidence of someone who believed she was helping the right side. Now she kept her hands folded tightly, as if the file Judge Mercer had read aloud had made every assumption less comfortable. I stood with one folder, walked to the center of the courtroom, and asked her to repeat what she had said about my grandfather discussing changes to his will after my visits became more frequent. She nodded and said that was how she remembered it. I asked for dates. Helen hesitated, then gave 3 approximate weekends, each one spoken with less certainty than the last. I thanked her, opened the folder, and handed official deployment travel orders to the clerk. On the first date, I was in Germany. On the second, I was in Kuwait. On the third, I was attached to a procurement review team across the country, nowhere near Arthur's house, nowhere near his attorney, nowhere near the conversations Helen had placed me inside. Victor objected to tone before I even used one. Judge Mercer overruled him. I looked at Helen and asked, "So when you said those conversations happened after my visits, that was not something you knew, that was something you assumed?" Her face tightened. "I suppose so." "You suppose?" She looked down. "Yes, I assumed." That word moved through the case more powerfully than any speech could have. Victor had built suspicion out of assumptions, and the first one had just admitted its own name. Raymond Hollis came next. The day before, he had described Arthur as isolated, lonely, surrounded mainly by me, vulnerable to influence because fewer people were checking on him. He had said it with the solemn concern of a man who enjoyed sounding important. I asked how many times he had visited my grandfather during the final year of his life. He said several. I handed him the visitor logs from Arthur's care facility. Raymond had visited twice. Neither visit lasted more than 18 minutes. I did not raise my voice. "Did you ever hear my grandfather say I pressured him?" "No." "Did you ever see me restrict his visitors?" "No." "Did you ever ask him whether he wanted more contact with my father or Brett?" Raymond swallowed. "No." "Then your testimony about isolation is not based on observation." He looked toward Victor, but Victor could not answer for him. "No," Raymond said quietly. "It is not." Then Clara Whitman took the stand, and unlike everyone Victor had presented as concerned, Clara had records. She had coordinated Arthur's care after the stroke. She testified that Arthur managed his own calendar, requested private legal calls himself, and personally asked that every conversation about his will be documented. She confirmed 2 cognitive evaluations before the revised estate plan was finalized. Arthur was weaker, yes, but not confused, not controlled, not helpless. Across the aisle, Brett whispered angrily until Victor told him to stop. Warren's hands tightened around each other. Marianne watched me with tears in her eyes, but I could not tell whether they were regret or fear, so I looked away. During the break, I stood alone in the restroom, gripping the sink while my hands shook. "Not yet," I whispered. Then I returned. Victor tried to recover by saying this case was not about dates, but emotional influence. I opened the next folder and said, "Then we should discuss who was actually trying to influence him." Victor's recovery attempt was smooth, but it came too late. He said the case was not about travel orders or visitor logs, but emotional influence, the kind that could not always be captured in documents. I let him finish because that was another habit careless people had. They thought if they changed the language, they changed the facts. I opened the next folder and introduced Arthur's bank records. Victor objected immediately, arguing relevance, privacy, and scope, anything that might keep the numbers from becoming part of the room. Judge Mercer allowed them because motive mattered. And once motive entered the case, the story my father and brother had built began turning against them. Over 10 years, Arthur had loaned or given Warren and Brett hundreds of thousands of dollars. Brett's failed gym franchise, Brett's unpaid business credit line, Warren's tax penalties, Warren's real estate debt, emergencies, investments, temporary needs, and family promises mostly never repaid. I did not call them greedy. The records did it for me. Then I introduced the emails obtained through discovery. Brett had written, "If Grandpa leaves everything to Olivia, we're dead." Warren had replied, "He respects pressure. We need to make him understand what family loyalty means." Another message from Brett said, "She calls him every Sunday. That makes us look bad." Warren answered, "Then fix the story before she becomes the story." For the first time, the courtroom understood the difference between concern and access. They were not worried Arthur had been manipulated. They were worried Arthur had stopped being useful. Warren stared at the table as if looking down could pull the words back into the screen. Brett kept whispering to Victor, but Victor barely responded. He had the expression of a man realizing his clients had not hired him to reveal truth. They had hired him to bury fingerprints. There was one more timeline. 2 months before Arthur finalized the will, Warren and Brett met him privately after telling the care facility it was a family lunch. That same afternoon, Arthur emailed Nora Bell. His words were formal, sharp, and unmistakably his. "I want all future estate conversations documented. Warren and Brett are no longer to be included unless counsel is present." Victor stopped writing after that. Then came the hardest piece. Nora had given it to me during discovery, and I had listened to it once because hearing Arthur's voice felt like touching a wound before it had closed. It was a recorded statement made with his attorney present. Judge Mercer allowed it. Arthur's voice filled the room. "Olivia did not ask me for money. She did not ask me for property. She asked whether I had eaten, whether I had slept, whether I needed the porch rail fixed. Warren asked what would happen to the estate. Brett asked what he was owed. That is the difference." I lowered my head before anyone could see what that did to me. Arthur continued, "If they accuse her after I die, ask them this. Did she love me before she knew what I owned? Because she did, and they did not." Marianne cried. Brett looked furious, not ashamed. Warren did not move. Victor closed his notebook. Judge Mercer let the silence remain. I thought that recording was the end. I was wrong, because Arthur had left one more truth behind, and this one was not about the will. It was about my father. Victor Langley closed his notebook before Judge Mercer asked the question, and that small movement told me more than any argument could have. He had entered that courtroom believing he was defending a wronged son and a cheated grandson. Now he was sitting beside 2 men whose records had betrayed them. Judge Mercer looked at him and said, "Counsel, do the plaintiffs intend to continue pursuing the claim of undue influence?" Victor stood slowly. He did not look at me first. He looked at Warren, then at Brett, and something like regret crossed his face. "Given the evidentiary record, Your Honor, we will not proceed on that claim." Brett snapped upright. "What are you doing?" Victor did not answer. That silence was the first honest thing he had given the room. Even their own lawyer would not keep carrying the lie. Judge Mercer's ruling came without drama, which somehow made it feel heavier. Arthur Hayes had capacity. The will was valid. I had not exerted undue influence. The plaintiffs had failed to present credible evidence of manipulation, fraud, or coercion. The estate distribution would stand, and Warren and Brett would be responsible for costs from their failed challenge. People expected me to smile. I did not. Winning did not erase the fact that my father and brother had tried to turn my love for Arthur into a crime. Then I stood. "There is one additional matter, Your Honor." Victor's head lifted. Warren's face changed before I even opened the packet. and that was how I knew he understood what was coming. Weeks earlier, I had requested that a sealed filing be reviewed only after the court ruled on the will, because I did not want Warren claiming I was using unrelated allegations to influence the inheritance decision. Now the will was secure, and the second truth had its turn. The packet contained undisclosed transfers from Arthur's accounts before his death, a shell company linked to Warren estate-related assets never reported in probate, and one transfer Brett believed had gone to save his failed business. It had not. It had been redirected to cover Warren's private real estate debt. Brett turned toward our father. "You told me that money was for my company," Warren whispered. "Not here." Brett's voice rose. "You used me?" For the first time, my brother did not look golden. He looked like someone finally realizing he had been protected only while protection served Warren. I watched him learn in 1 minute what I had known since childhood. My father's love always came with a condition. Judge Mercer said the financial materials would be referred for further review. Victor lowered his head. Marianne kept repeating Warren's name, as if saying it enough times could pull him back into the version of himself she preferred. Warren tried to stand, then looked at me with raw hatred. "You did this to me." "No," I said. "I documented what you did." His hand went to his chest, his knees buckled. Brett reached for him too late. I stood frozen, feeling no triumph, only the terrible grief of watching the man who never protected me become fragile in front of everyone. People think revenge feels like fire. That day, it felt like every lie my family built finally running out of air. Hours later, I walked out of the courthouse alone. The sky was gray, like the first morning of trial, but I was not the same woman who had walked in. I was not healed. I was not happy. I still had a father in the hospital, a mother who had chosen guilt over accountability, and a brother who had learned our father's love could be rented, redirected, and withdrawn. Beneath all of that, there was something I had not felt in years: freedom. Warren survived, but survival did not become an apology. That night, Marianne texted, "Your father is fragile right now. Please do not make things worse." I stared at the message, then turned the phone face down. Making things worse had always meant telling the truth before they were ready to hear it. Later, Brett sent one message. "Did you know Dad lied to me too?" I answered, "Now you know what it feels like to be useful until you are inconvenient." Then I put the phone away. The inheritance was never the revenge. The money was not the point. The courtroom was not even the point. The real revenge was that my grandfather's truth survived every lie they tried to build over it. Arthur had measured me correctly before anyone else did, and his records, words, and faith stood taller than their accusations. If you have ever been called cold because you stopped begging people to see your pain, I need you to hear me clearly. Being overlooked does not mean you are small. Being quiet does not mean you are weak. Being capable does not mean you deserved to carry everything alone. Family members who only recognize your value when money is involved were never confused about your worth. They were comfortable ignoring it. My grandfather once told me they were measuring me with the wrong ruler. For years, I thought I had to make them change it. But that day in court, I finally understood the truth. I did not need their ruler at all. So tell me, if your family tried to erase you until they needed what you had, would you forgive them? Or let the truth be the only inheritance they received?